I am gone, nah, do something different for chapter 13. We are gone, nah, talk about the legacy of 1621. But instead of trying to present some kind of comprehensive history of everything that happened in 1621, which is basically impossible because there's so much that happened in 1621, I want to talk about how the story of 1621 has been told and retold over the centuries. I want to focus on one particular story from 1621, the story of the first Thanksgiving feast, and I want to talk about how that story was born and how it became the story that we know today. This is going to be a little bit different than normal. I hope you like it. Let me know in the comments what you think, and let's get into chapter 13. It is November 1621. You've been here before. You've heard this story before. The Pilgrims have just arrived in Plymouth, Massachusetts, after a perilous journey across the ocean and a brutal winter in which more than half of them died. They are celebrating their first harvest feast with the local indigenous people. There were 53 surviving pilgrims and 90 members of the Wampanoag tribe who participated in this 3-day feast. They ate wildfowl and fish and venison, which was provided by the indigenous people. They ate corn, pumpkins, squash, beans, and other foods that the pilgrims had planted. And after 3 days of eating and celebration, the pilgrims decided that they were gone, start a tradition. And they would celebrate this day of giving thanks every year. And that's why we celebrate Thanksgiving every year. If you're new here, welcome. I am your host, and this is the 1621 Project, where I am telling the story of the Mayflower and the first Thanksgiving year by year. Now, if you've watched the videos in order, then you know that that story isn't exactly true. In fact, there were no Mayflower passengers at this feast. The Mayflower didn't arrive until December of 1620, and the first Thanksgiving was celebrated until 1623. But still, it's a good story, right? A story of pilgrims and Indians coming together in peace and friendship to celebrate the bounty of the New World. That sounds great. Let's all just hold hands and sing Kumbaya. Except the problem is that that's not really what happened either. I mean, the basic bones of the story are correct. There was a harvest feast in Plymouth in 1621, and there were probably around 50 to 100 indigenous people from the Wampanoag tribe who participated in it. But the details of the story, the details that have become so ingrained in our national consciousness, those details weren't really written down until almost 200 years after the feast actually took place. In 1850, a man named Alexander Young wrote a story called The First Thanksgiving. It was published in a popular magazine of the time called The Knickerbocker, and in this story, Young imagined what it must have been like to be at that first Thanksgiving feast. He wrote, "The scene now is one of unmingled joy. All care and anxiety are forgotten. The season of plenty is come, and the hearts of the colonists and their Indian friends are light and gay as the song of the robin or the lark." Young went on to describe the festivities of the 3-day feast, the parades and games and bonfires and fireworks and everything. And he ended the story with a reenactment of the prayer that Edward Winslow supposedly gave at the first Thanksgiving. Young's story was wildly popular when it was published. It was reprinted dozens of times in newspapers and magazines and school books throughout the 19th century, and it formed the basis for the Thanksgiving story that most Americans know today. There's just one small problem. Almost none of it is true. We don't know what the first Thanksgiving looked like. There were no written accounts from any pilgrim describing what happened. The only source we have is a one-sentence reference in a letter that Edward Winslow wrote to a friend back in England, and in that letter, Winslow simply stated that they had a 3-day feast and invited the neighboring tribes to participate. There's nothing about parades or games or bonfires or fireworks or any of the other things that Alexander Young described in his story. So where did that stuff come from? Well, some of it came from other stories that were being told about the Pilgrims at the time. Stories like The Thanksgiving of the Pilgrims by Lydia Maria Child, which was published in 1837. In that story, Child described the Pilgrims marching in a parade to the top of Coles Hill to give thanks to God for their deliverance from the perils of the sea. And she also talked about them releasing doves and balloons into the air and having a huge bonfire to celebrate. None of that happened at the 1621 feast, but it sounded pretty cool. So Young probably borrowed it from Child's story and added it to his version. But a lot of the details in Young's story also came from another source, a book called The History of New England, by George Vescovo, and while Vespers was writing a serious historical account of the colonial era, he also wove a lot of fanciful detail into his book. For example, he described an incident that allegedly happened during the first Thanksgiving feast. Supposedly, one of the pilgrims, John Alden, was sitting next to a beautiful Native American woman named Priscilla Mullins, and when Alden turned to talk to her, sparks flew and they fell in love. Sparks may have indeed flown, but there's no evidence that this story is true. Vespers got the idea from an 1824 book called The New England Galaxy, which published a fictionalized account of the meeting between Alden and Priscilla. These details, these romantic notions of pilgrims and Native Americans coming together in peace and friendship, they've been part of our national consciousness for hundreds of years. We see it in paintings like The First Thanksgiving by Jenny M. Atwater. Atwater's painting was completed in 1859, just after Alexander Young's story was published, and it shows a group of stern-faced pilgrims sitting at a table with equally stern-faced Native Americans. But even though the faces are stern, the overall message of the painting is clear. The pilgrims and the Native Americans are friends. They're sharing a meal together. They're giving thanks together. And the painting reinforces the notion that the United States was founded on a spirit of cooperation between these two groups. But that's not really what happened. Not at that first Thanksgiving, and not in the decades that followed. As William Bradford, the governor of Plymouth Colony, wrote in his journal, the relationship between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag was complicated, and while there were times of cooperation and friendship, there were also times of conflict and distrust. One of the reasons that Massasoit and his warriors helped the Pilgrims in 1621 was that the English represented a potential ally against their enemies, the Narragansett. But within just a few years, the Pilgrims had broken that alliance and were fighting alongside the Narragansett against the Pequot. And as Bradford wrote, the land that the Pilgrims claimed was already occupied by the Wampanoag and other tribes, and they would continue to encroach on tribal lands throughout the 1620s and 1630s. The story of peaceful coexistence between the Pilgrims and the Native Americans was a myth that only became popular almost 200 years after the events of 1621. By that point, the relationship between colonists and Native Americans had deteriorated significantly. There were wars, and broken treaties, and broken alliances, and millions of acres of tribal land had been taken by European colonists. The Thanksgiving story, with its message of cooperation and friendship, it seemed to offer a better vision of the past, a vision that might have been more appealing in happier times, but certainly wasn't by the mid-19th century. Now, if you're watching this video on November, then you know that Thanksgiving is coming up. And if you're celebrating Thanksgiving this year, I hope you have a wonderful holiday with your family and friends. I hope you get to spend time with loved ones and eat delicious food, and I hope you take some time to reflect on all the things you have to be thankful for. Now, if you'd like to support the work that I do here, one of the best ways you can do that is by becoming a member on a website. Members get access to a monthly podcast, where I talk about topics related to the Mayflower and the early colonial period, and I release new episodes every single month. So if you'd like to learn more about those bonus podcasts, go ahead and check out the link in the description below. If you enjoyed this episode, then you'll probably enjoy the one that comes out next week, where I talk about what Edward Winslow's journal can teach us about the culture of Plymouth Colony. And if you haven't already, please make sure you subscribe. And with that, I'll see you next week for Chapter 14.